They told me it was just stress, said I must have done it to myself somehow. But when I opened my eyes on my son's wedding day, my hair, what was left of it, was on the floor right beside my bed. And Rachel, my daughter, had already gone ahead and told the guests I was being evaluated for some kind of psychiatric episode. That's how I found out I no longer had a place in their world. I'm Elaine Harper. I used to bake apple pies and tuck in dreams at night, but that morning it hit me. I wasn't the mother of the groom anymore. I was just someone they needed to keep out of sight. Have you ever felt like your own child erased you? Stay with me. Maybe you'll hear your own silence echo in mine. That morning, I came down the stairs, holding on to the guest house railing. Rachel's voice floated across the foyer. She was talking to a couple of bridesmaids. One of them glanced at me and quickly looked away, giving a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "She's resting now," Rachel had said, like I wasn't even there. "It's been a lot for her lately. We've all tried so hard." I reached for the back of my head. There wasn't much left, but enough was gone to notice. The strands I saw earlier in the bathroom sink weren't falling out from stress. They were too neatly cut. There weren't any scissors around. But the old chemo wig I hadn't touched in years, it was sitting right on the bureau, like someone had already planned for all of this. I got dressed quietly. I put on the pale blue wrap dress I'd ironed the night before. I even pinned the antique brooch to the collar. Rachel used to call it Old Lady Sparkle. I wore it anyway. It was the only thing that felt familiar to me that morning. Rachel didn't check on me, not once. I heard her laugh echo down the hallway, smooth and confident. She always knew how to perform when people were watching. Later, when the reception started, I found my seat alone at a table meant for 10. My name was written on the card in delicate script, Elaine Harper. Everyone else was still out mingling. I smiled at a few guests who passed by. A couple nodded. Most didn't even glance my way. I stayed in my seat while people lined up for the buffet. I didn't move. A bridesmaid I didn't know leaned toward someone beside her and whispered, "I didn't know her breakdown was that bad. Rachel's so strong." I stared down at the napkin in my lap, perfectly folded, never touched. When Rachel stood up for her toast, she raised her glass and said, "Family is about grace, even when mental health challenges show up unexpectedly." Her voice was sweet and steady. Everyone clapped politely. Daniel, my son, just looked down into his drink. No one looked at me. That's when it all made sense. The wig, the whispers, the quiet space around me. This wasn't just misunderstanding. It was deliberate. Rachel had rewritten the story before I even woke up. I slipped out without saying anything. No one followed. Back in the guest room bathroom, I locked the door and stood under the light. My reflection looked dull, but sharp in all the places that hurt, not because of the missing hair, but because of the silence. All the trust I'd poured out slowly over the years, now gone, like it had never been there. I didn't cry. I picked up the wig and gently placed it on my head, adjusting it the way I used to. It still fit a little too tight, still felt a little too false. Then I picked up my phone, not to call anyone. I started taking pictures of the room, the wig, the name card. Then I went back to the reception. I didn't say a word. If you've ever had to smile through something that quietly broke your heart just to keep the peace, I hope you'll leave a comment. I'd like to know I'm not the only one. And if any part of this story felt even a little bit familiar, maybe consider subscribing. I'll be sharing more soon. The next chapter? Let's just say you can learn a lot at a wedding, especially when no one saves you a seat. I didn't run that day, but I didn't really stay either. I just sort of disappeared, right there in the middle of everything, under those white lanterns swaying gently like they were tired too. I'd found my assigned table, table 10. No one else seemed to be seated there. Just 10 white chairs surrounding a centerpiece of wilting roses. I sat down, folded my hands, and waited. I don't even know what I was waiting for. Maybe someone from Daniel's side would recognize me. Maybe one of Rachel's old teachers. But they all walked past like I wasn't there, like I was just part of the background. I used to think weddings were about family, but now I see it differently. They're about performance, about who smiles the brightest in the photos, who gets tagged, who gets edited out. A boy came up to me. He couldn't have been more than 19, wearing a black vest and looking nervous. "Hi, ma'am. Rachel said maybe you'd want to lie down. She said you've done enough." I looked up at him. I could see it in his eyes that this wasn't his idea. He was just repeating what someone told him to say. I smiled politely, even though I'd just been asked to step away from my own daughter's wedding. My phone buzzed. It was Sandra. She'd texted, "Did she really say you're unwell? I saw her story post." My chest tightened. I opened the app, and there was Rachel, standing between two of her friends, holding a mimosa. Her caption said, "Love and healing. Family shows up in all forms." I stared at those words for a long time. Healing? From what? And just like that, I remembered her college graduation. I remembered her standing on that stage, voice shaking, saying, "My mom is my rock." The whole room clapped. I cried. When did I go from being a rock to being something she wanted to bury? I stood up and walked slowly along the edge of the reception tent. My heels kept sinking into the grass, but I didn't care. I watched Rachel laugh and pose with guests under an arch of fake flowers. I noticed no one mentioned my name. No one looked my way. It was like I had been erased. Daniel found me near the fence by the vineyard. He was holding a glass of wine, mostly untouched. "Elaine," he said, "let's not make this about anything else, okay?" He didn't even look at me when he said it. And that was the part that hurt. He hadn't really looked at me in years. I didn't say anything. I stepped out of my shoes and let my feet touch the grass. It was damp and soft. I walked into the rows of vines, the cool soil pressing into my soles. I kept walking until the music faded, until even the DJ's voice felt like a memory. Out there, in the quiet, I could finally think. I wasn't angry, not in the way people usually imagine. I felt something gentler, sadder, a kind of grief that doesn't come with tears, the kind that just sits next to you, quiet and familiar, like an old friend who knows exactly what you're not saying. The next morning, I packed before the sun came up. I folded my dress into a plastic bag. I deleted every photo from my phone, the flower arrangements, the table settings, every smile I'd forced just to get through it. When I dropped the room key at the front desk, I didn't say a word. No checkout form, no goodbye. I didn't need anyone to see me leave. Sometimes silence is the loudest thing you have left. I didn't go home. I went somewhere that still smelled like something I could name. The cottage sat at the edge of a lavender field, tucked behind a row of wind-bent pine trees near Hood River. There was no gate, no porch light, just a gravel path lined with forget-me-nots, and the soft hum of bees floating in the spring air. The key was under the mat, just like the host had said in her message. When I opened the door, the scent greeted me right away. Lavender and cedarwood. It smelled clean, quiet, and kind. I stood there for a while, not moving. My hands still carried the faint scent of rose water from the wedding napkins. I rinsed them slowly at the kitchen sink, then turned on the kettle. It had been years since I'd written in a journal, maybe decades, but there was a small notebook on the table, its blank pages looking like they'd been waiting for me. I flipped to the first page and wrote the date. Just doing that felt like I was reclaiming something. The kettle started to whistle. And then a memory came back. Rachel, at 3 years old, just out of the bath, wrapped in a towel that smelled like baby shampoo and sunlight, her curls still damp, her cheeks pink. She used to lean her whole body into mine when she was tired. I could still feel the weight of that trust. I made some tea and pulled out a few pieces of unopened mail from my purse. Most were just circulars and old receipts, but in the middle there was a pale blue envelope I didn't recognize at first. The handwriting was familiar, loopy and soft. It was from Charlotte. It had been sent 3 weeks earlier. She wrote, "Elaine, darling, I don't know where you are emotionally these days, but I'll be in Seaview next month for the Quiet Circle retreat. There's always room for you. Just come as you are, no explanations needed." I stared at those words. Come as you are. I wasn't even sure I knew what that meant anymore. Later that morning, I put on an old cardigan and walked down the slope behind the cottage. The lavender field was just beginning to bloom. The rows were soft and green, with hints of purple starting to peek through. I breathed in deeply and closed my eyes. I remembered 1989, when Rachel got lost in a lavender maze during a farm festival. She'd wandered off chasing a butterfly, and for 20 minutes, I thought I might never see her again. When I finally found her, her face was streaked with tears and dirt. She clung to me and whispered, "I thought you left me." Now it was my turn. I was the one who felt lost. Only this time, no one was coming to find me. At a little cafe in town, the woman behind the counters smiled at me and handed me a warm apple pastry in a paper bag. She had kind eyes and a paint smudge on her cheek. "You look like someone who needs hope," she said, tapping the bag. There was a sunflower sketched on it in black pen. I thanked her, but I didn't know what else to say. Back at the cottage, I poured more tea and sat down at a small wooden desk by the window. I watched the lavender move gently in the wind. Then I picked up the pen and opened the notebook again. This time I wrote a full sentence. "I am not what she says I am." The words stayed on the page. They weren't fancy or poetic, but they were true, and they were mine. Before bed, I opened my laptop and searched for train schedules. Seaview, one way. I clicked confirm without thinking too much. I didn't tell Rachel. I didn't tell anyone. I folded the printed ticket and slipped it under my teacup. The lavender wasn't fully in bloom yet, but I was. If any part of this feels familiar, if you've ever sat at a table where no one noticed you, or walked away just to hear yourself think, I'd love to hear from you. Leave me a comment if you'd like. I read every one. And if you're curious where that train ticket is taking me next, I hope you'll stick around. There's more to this story, and something tells me part of it might sound a little like yours too. You're always welcome here. If you'd like to follow along, feel free to subscribe. No pressure, just company. I arrived with nothing but a duffel bag and the scent of lavender still clinging to the edge of my scarf. The train ride had been quiet, almost too quiet, like it didn't want to interrupt whatever was coming next. Charlotte's cottage sat at the edge of a pine grove in Spokane. It was solid and square, wrapped in vines that hadn't quite decided if spring had truly arrived. The porch creaked as I stepped onto it. Before I could even knock, the door opened. "You hungry or just tired?" Charlotte asked, wiping her hands on an apron dusted with flour. She didn't hug me. She didn't tilt her head and say something like, "Poor thing." She just made room for me. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and pine cleaner. There were mismatched chairs, quilts folded neatly on a rocker, and cabinets full of loose-leaf tea. I hadn't realized how much I missed the soft sound of a kettle starting to whisper. That night, we baked bread. Well, Charlotte did most of it. I followed her lead. My hands pressed into the dough in a rhythm I hadn't learned yet. The silence between us didn't feel empty. It felt kind. She only asked me one question. "Crusty or soft?" she said, glancing over her shoulder. "Crusty," I replied. I didn't even know I felt that way until I said it out loud. Charlotte had 2 other guests staying with her that season: Lily, a young teacher with ink-stained fingers, and Martha, a retired nurse who liked to knit through breakfast. They greeted me politely, but didn't push for anything more. No one asked me why I was there. No one even asked my last name. That was one of Charlotte's rules. You only share who you were if you want to. Each room in the house had a name carved into little pine plaques. I passed one called the Stay Room and another called Tuesday Always. But it was the one at the end of the hall that made me stop. It read, "For those who left too late." The words sat on the frame like a quiet reminder, maybe a warning, maybe a kind of blessing. Charlotte saw me reading. "That one's mine," she said, but I stayed there longer than I should have. She led me to another room. It was simple, clean, with a window facing the woods and a chair that looked almost comfortable. "This one's called Harper East," she said. "We've never had an Elaine. Let's see who she becomes." I don't think she meant for that sentence to land so heavily, but it did. That room wasn't just a place to sleep. It felt like a space where I could let go of who I'd been and maybe start again. After she left, I sat at the edge of the bed. The quilt was stitched with uneven lines, like someone had made peace with their mistakes and left them there, visible. I opened the nightstand drawer and found a photo. It was Charlotte, bald and smiling, standing on top of a mountain trail with her arms lifted high, like victory didn't need to be loud. On the back, she'd written in her soft, loopy handwriting, "Still here." That night, I didn't cry, I didn't call anyone, I didn't explain anything. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea from a tin in the kitchen and sat by the window. The woods outside were still. The stars were faint, but there. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to earn my place in the room. We never talked about what Rachel did. But one morning, Charlotte asked me how I liked my eggs. "Scrambled," I said. She gave a small nod and cracked a few into a cast-iron pan already warm with butter. Outside, the garden was covered in that kind of morning dew that makes everything feel a little softer. The lavender patch still held on to a light mist, blurring the edges of the blooms that were starting to fade. Inside, the kitchen smelled like sage and faint wood smoke, curling through the air like a memory that knew how to stay quiet. Charlotte moved with the ease of someone who used to be tired but had made peace with it. She stirred, flipped, and plated the food without a word. Then she sat across from me and slowly started peeling an orange, steady and precise. "My daughter left during my chemo," she said, just like that. Told me I was manipulating her. Said me losing my hair made everything about me. She set the orange peel aside and passed me a small, worn photograph. It was the two of us, younger. Me with darker hair, Charlotte before the gray. We were standing outside some flea market in Portland, laughing about something I longer remember. On the back, written in her bold handwriting, were the words, "If I forget who I am, you don't. That's your job." I gave her that, she said quietly. She mailed it back to me last year. No note. I didn't know what to say, so I folded the photo along its old crease and slipped it into my cardigan pocket. Somehow, it felt like it knew the way home better than I did. Later that morning, Charlotte handed me the mail. One of the envelopes had Daniel's handwriting on it. Familiar, neat, tilted just a little to the right, like it had been since middle school. Inside, he'd written, "Rachel said it wasn't true, Mom. She was just trying to help. She told me you were confused. I'm sorry you felt hurt." I didn't finish reading. I slid it back into the envelope and tucked it between two cookbooks on the shelf, face down. After breakfast, we went out to the garden to pull carrots. The soil was still damp and carried that sweet, earthy smell. Charlotte knelt down easily, brushing dirt off the roots with gloved hands. "Underground things always show up eventually," she said with a grin. I smiled back, but my chest tightened. I couldn't stop thinking about 2007. Rachel had sat between my knees, still a little girl, her head bowed while I gently braided the last strands of her hair after my chemo. She didn't want a mirror. She just wanted my fingers, and my voice softly telling her, "Almost done, sweetheart." Now I was the one without the mirror. I dropped the trowel. The words came before I even knew I was ready to say them. I'm not mad that she cut my hair. I'm mad she knew she could. Charlotte didn't flinch. She leaned back, wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek, and looked straight at me. "Then what will you do with that anger?" she asked. That night, I stood in the bathroom staring at myself. My reflection didn't look old, just tired. But there was something else there, too, a quiet sense of readiness. I picked up the kitchen scissors. They weren't sharp, but they do. I pulled my hair forward and cut it in one even length. Each snip felt clean, intentional. The uneven weight disappeared with every cut. It didn't look polished. It didn't have to. It just looked like mine. Spring came back slowly, like a favor you didn't ask for, but quietly decided to accept. Every morning, I'd sit by the window and watch it return. Little buds started to open on the dogwood tree. Birds fussed in the gutters. The ground finally stopped being frozen. The room smelled like dried lavender. Charlotte had tucked little bundles above the windows, under the bed, even inside the drawers. Every time I opened one, it gave off the softest scent, like it was whispering calm into the air. One afternoon, I found a card slipped under my door. Pale pink, thin envelope, Rachel's handwriting on the back. It was a Mother's Day card, one of those store-bought kinds, with scripted butterflies and a line of cheerful words that didn't really say anything. Inside, it said, "Hope you're well. Things are fine here. No love, Rachel." No thank you, just those few words. I read it 3 times, then I tucked it under a stack of cookbooks without saying anything. Charlotte didn't ask. She just handed me a small lavender sachet that smelled like rain and something older, like the kind of hope that's been through a lot. "Keep what calms you," she said while pouring tea. "Toss the rest." I held the sachet against my chest longer than I meant to. Later that week, a small envelope showed up in the mail. It had been forwarded from Portland. No return address. Inside was a postcard I'd left behind months ago at a little cafe. The one with the blue velvet booths and the girl at the counter who always gave free refills without asking. The front of the postcard showed a watercolor field of lavender. Back then, I had written one line, trying to remember who I was before the silence. Now, in different ink, someone had written underneath it, "Some people leave more than they mean to. Hope the lavender's blooming for you." I didn't recognize the handwriting, but it felt like a thread tied to something warm. That evening, I sat at my desk with a fresh journal and wrote Rachel a letter. I never planned to send it. I wrote, "I'm not crazy. I was just tired. Tired of pretending not to see you disappearing, of lowering my voice so yours could rise, of being the coat rack at every party, present but never worn." I kept writing until my wrist started to ache. Then I folded the letter and placed it in a terracotta pot in the garden. I struck a match and watched the flame curl around the paper, watched the words turn to ash, one apology at a time. When the fire was gone, I knelt beside the garden bed. I pressed my hands into the dirt and pulled out weeds that had no right growing there. I cried, but not from sadness, from something heavier, something I'd carried too long in a space that no longer fit. The next morning, Charlotte was already in the kitchen making breakfast. She didn't look up when she asked, "Want to come with me on a trip next month?" I didn't ask where. I just nodded. I hadn't planned on running into him, definitely not on telling him the truth. Charlotte and I got on the train just after sunrise. She packed some ginger tea and apples into a canvas tote, humming quietly as we settled into the rhythm of goodbye. We sat side by side until the station outside Reading. That's when she gently touched my wrist and said, "You know where you're going." Then she stepped off and disappeared into a crowd full of backpacks and bus tickets. I stayed on. The train headed south, winding around the cliffs and along the foggy coastline until the city started rising up in the windows. San Francisco wrapped itself around us in glass and gray. The shop was still there,
tucked in a narrow alley off Hyde Street, behind a crooked little sign that said Horology and Hands. The gold letters were fading. The whole place smelled like cedar shavings and oiled brass, like time itself had decided to sit still for a while. Thomas was hunched over a workbench, glasses halfway down his nose, a magnifier clipped on like it had something to prove. He hadn't changed much, still wore that corduroy vest, still tapped his thumb on the table when he was thinking. When he looked up, he blinked once, then again. "Elaine?" His voice was soft, like it had been holding space for too long. We didn't hug, just stood there for a moment, measuring the years in silence. Then he nodded toward the kettle. "Still take your tea with lemon?" I nodded back. Over lunch, in the little room behind the shop, we shared sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and mugs of tea. He didn't ask anything, just listened. I told him about Charlotte, about the Lavender, about how I kept waking up in places I didn't remember choosing.
I didn't mention the wedding, or the scissors, or the photos I deleted, but maybe he understood anyway. He always had a way of hearing the quiet between words. He showed me a table he'd built himself. The wood was dark, stained with time and care. "People bring me their ghosts," he said, holding up a tiny broken clock, no bigger than a plum, "and expect me to make them tick again." I picked up a cloth and started polishing a brass casing. My hands moved slowly, steady. "You still act?" I asked, glancing at an old poster leaning near the coat rack. "Death of a Salesman, 1982. His name in faded print, right below mine." "No," he said with a half smile. "These days, I prefer things that don't lie for a living." When it was time to go, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a silver button, the same kind that used to be on my costume from our town. One had popped off during a rehearsal we never finished. "I kept it," he said. "Figured you'd come back for it. Took you long enough." I didn't say anything, just closed the box and held it in both hands like it had waited too long to be claimed. At the door, I leaned in and kissed his cheek, then whispered, "I might, if I remember how." On the train ride back, my hands wouldn't stop trembling, not from nerves, not from fear, from something deeper, something like recognition, like I'd touched the edge of a life I almost had, and it hadn't punished me for wanting it again. The city faded behind me in soft gray tones, clocks ticking in my coat pocket, and that silver button still warm in my palm. Have you ever run into someone from your past and realized you're no longer the person they remember? That maybe, somewhere along the way, you quietly outgrew who you used to be? If that's ever happened to you, or if there's someone you've been meaning to write to but haven't, I'd love to hear your story. Feel free to share it in the comments. And if you're curious where I go from here, whether I write that letter or let silence speak for me, I hope you'll stay. You're welcome to subscribe if you'd like. No pressure, just quiet company on the road back to ourselves. The thing about rumors is, if you don't correct them, they start to settle in like they belong. They become the version people hold on to. When I walked into Dr. Morrison's office, the receptionist smiled at me, but it was that soft, careful kind of smile, the kind you offer after a funeral. "Take your time, Elaine," she said gently, sliding a clipboard toward me. "He's running a bit behind." The waiting room smelled like mint hand lotion and old paper. A couple sitting across from me whispered to each other about cholesterol. I folded my scarf over my lap and tried not to fidget. When Dr. Morrison finally called me in, he didn't meet my eyes right away. He asked about my joints, my appetite, whether I'd been sleeping okay. And then, while typing something into the screen, he said it, so gently I almost missed it. "I'm glad to see you're feeling better. I wasn't sure if you wanted psychoactive support listed again." I blanked. Support? He paused, then turned the monitor slightly toward me. There it was, my emergency file, Rachel's name listed as my contact. And right next to it, it said, "Recent incapacitation, monitor for psychiatric compliance." My breath caught. I said slowly, "That's not true. I haven't been hospitalized. I haven't been medicated." He shifted in his chair, visibly uncomfortable. "It came through on a family portal update a few months ago. HIPAA doesn't always flag those the way it should. Never mind, we can correct it." But it was already too late. The story had found its place in the record. It had a timestamp now. Later that day, I dropped off a bag of old books at the community center. The place still smelled like waxed floors and the faint rubber scent of kids' sneakers. I left the bag by the front desk and turned to go. That's when I heard her. "That's the one Rachel talked about," someone whispered behind me. "Her poor mother, mental decline, so sad." It was Olivia's voice, my old neighbor, the one who used to borrow cookie tins from me every December. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. By the time I reached the sidewalk, my face was burning and my palms had gone cold. It felt like drowning in a reflection someone else had created. I ended up wandering into a used bookstore without really meaning to. Dust floated in the late afternoon light, just like it always had. I walked past the fiction section, past the cookbooks, and stopped in front of a shelf filled with blank journals. I picked one, navy blue, thick pages. At the register, the clerk asked if I needed a bag. I just shook my head. I sat on a bench outside. My pen trembled slightly in my hand. I opened to the first page and wrote one line. She named my reality, and people clapped. That was all, but it was enough. Back at the cottage that night, I made a cup of tea and lit a candle. The house was quiet. Charla had already gone to bed. I opened the drawer by my bed and took out an envelope. It was blank on the front. I just stared at it. Not to Rachel, not yet. But I knew someone needed to hear me. Someone who hadn't already decided who I was. And this time, I wasn't going to let silence decide for me. Some things you burn. Some things you keep. And some things you write down so they don't get twisted later. I was sitting in the reception area of a small legal office in Spokane. There was a quiet fan humming in the corner, and the air smelled faintly like lemon cleaner and old wood. It reminded me of somewhere between a courthouse and a grandmother's attic. A photo of the Spokane River hung above a tired ficus plant that had clearly seen better days. A young paralegal named Nora came out to greet me. She had a calm voice, steady eyes, the kind of person who doesn't flinch easily. She offered me tea, but I shook my head. My hands were already wrapped too tightly around the folder I'd brought. "Charlotte spoke highly of you," I said as we sat down. "She said you're clear," Nora replied. "That's my favorite kind of client." I opened the folder and spread out the papers. My will, my advance directive, my medical proxies, all printed neatly in black ink. But every line seemed to carry a hum underneath, like the weight of names and choices pressed into the page. "I'd like Rachel's name removed from everything," I said. My voice stayed steady. Nora blinked once, then nodded. "Understood. Any replacements?" "Yes," I told her. "Charlotte will be my backup contact. And here," I handed her a handwritten note, "this is a clause for no contact. If there's interference, I want it recorded." We worked through it carefully. The wording was firm but quiet, no drama, no accusations, just a slow, deliberate reclaiming of my own story. When we finished, Nora handed me a copy to review. I brought it home and read it that night, in my room with the lavender bundles still hanging above the window. Then I reached for a fresh sheet of paper. "Dear Daniel, this isn't about punishment. I know you didn't start this, but you let it grow. I need space now, not because I stopped loving you, but because I finally remembered how to love myself without asking permission." I folded the letter and placed it into a clean envelope. On the front, I wrote in thick black ink, "Do not forward to Rachel." At twilight, I walked it down to the little post box by the road. The sun had already dipped behind the trees, but the air still held the heavy heat of August. Cicadas murmured in the background like old women trading secrets in church pews. I slid the envelope into the slot and stood there for a moment, fingertips tingling.
It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like recognition, like finishing a sentence in my own voice. That evening, just as the first stars began to show, my phone buzzed. It was Charlotte. "Hey," she said, "you ready for visitors?" I hesitated. Visitors? I have a feeling someone's coming. I looked out the window toward the garden. The lavender had started blooming again, crooked but resilient. "I think I am," I whispered, "but only if they knock first." She laughed softly. "Fair enough." I hung up and leaned back in my chair. The copy of my new will sat beside me. I didn't feel lighter, not exactly, but I felt aligned, like something inside me had finally clicked into place. Not loudly, not triumphantly, just quietly, truly. That's the thing about taking your life back. It doesn't make headlines, but it makes peace. I didn't plan on speaking, but silence had stayed too long. The house was warm, a little too warm. Strings of soft golden lights hung from the ceiling, casting a glow over trays of glazed carrots, fig and brie, and those little pastry trees people always pretend to eat politely. Daniel's holiday party had grown since the last time I'd been invited. New neighbors, some of his coworkers. There was laughter near the buffet, wine glasses clinking in every corner. Rachel wasn't supposed to be there. That's what Daniel told me on the phone. He said, she's out of town. But there she was, wearing pearl earrings, a deep burgundy dress, with a soft smile that never quite reached her eyes. When our eyes met, she looked right past me, like I was a painting someone forgot to straighten. Daniel saw it. He mouthed, "I didn't know," and I believed him. But belief doesn't make the air any easier to breathe. Later in the evening, someone raised a glass and said, "Let's hear a few words from the matriarch." Daniel looked at me, hopeful. I shook my head. I wasn't ready to stand in that room and pretend everything was fine. Rachel stood up instead. She took the mic like it was second nature. "I just want to say how grateful I am for healing, for time, for second chances. Families aren't perfect, but love is messy and powerful." People nodded. Soft murmurs filled the room. No one asked for details. They just clapped. I stood up. I don't remember deciding to. My body moved on its own, like it had been waiting for this moment. I walked to the front and took the mic from its stand. Just held it for a breath. "My hair was taken while I slept," I said. Not to Rachel, to the room. That wasn't healing. That was control. A hush spread across the room like wind through dry leaves. "I'm not unwell," I said next. "I was just inconvenient." Silence. Rachel stared at me. Her mouth opened, then closed. She didn't say a word. I didn't wait for her to. I handed the mic to no one and walked toward the front door. Not fast, just finished. The cold outside met me like something honest. I stood on the porch, watching little clouds rise from my breath. My chest felt cracked open, but not broken, just aired out. A woman stepped out and stood beside me, maybe late 50s, red scarf, kind eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. I turned to her. "My daughter did something similar," she said. "It wasn't about what she did, it was about being erased." I nodded. That was exactly it. "You're not alone," she added. And for the first time in a long time, I believed her. The sky above us was cloudy. The stars were faint behind the winter haze, but I didn't feel lost, not anymore. Have you ever said something out loud, something you'd been holding for far too long, and felt the silence around you shift? Tonight was that night for me. And maybe you've had one too, or maybe yours is still coming. If this feels familiar, I hope you'll leave a comment. I'd love to hear how you found your voice, or how you're still learning to use it. And if you'd like to keep walking with me, wherever this path leads next, feel free to subscribe. It means more than you know. we're not alone, even when it feels like we are. When I got back, the lavender had bloomed again. It was late, but sure of itself. There was still a little snow along the edges of the garden path, curled like frosting that just wouldn't melt. But inside, the fire was going strong, and the scent of rosemary from the pot on the stove drifted through the damp February air. I took off my coat and finally hung it on the hook labeled Elaine. I'd walked past that hook every day for months, always folded the coat instead, always kept the suitcase zipped like I was about to leave again. That morning, I opened every drawer in my room. I folded sweaters I'd picked up from Goodwill, smoothed out the quilt Martha had lent me months ago. In the bottom drawer, I found a photo someone had taken last fall, me laughing in the garden, arms muddy, eyes squinting into the sun. I framed it, just for me. A postcard came in with the late mail. It was a faded shot of the Golden Gate Bridge in fog. On the back, Thomas had written, "Clock's still ticking. Yours too, I hope." No return address, just a little drawing of a brass gear in the corner. I didn't write back, not because I didn't want to, just because it was enough. Enough to know someone remembered the sound of my voice when I wasn't making it smaller. Later, Charlotte knocked on my door. She had 2 mugs of chamomile and a flyer in her hand. "I need help teaching this," she said. It was for a community writing group for women over 60. The flyer said, "You don't have to be published, you just have to have lived." I told her, "I've only written to ghosts." She looked at me and said, "Then maybe it's time you wrote to the living." I said yes, softly, but without hesitation. That night, I made stew. Real stew, not just tea and toast. I turned on some music, rearranged the books on the windowsill. I tucked the one about grief at the bottom, put the one about sourdough starters right on top, next to a little jar of dried bay leaves. When I opened my old suitcase one last time, there was a bundle of lavender tucked beneath the lining. It was brittle now, but still held its scent. I pressed it between the pages of my journal and wrote, Chapter 1. The next morning, Charlotte and I walked to the library. I signed up for a card. When the woman at the desk asked for an emergency contact, I gave her a small smile and shook my head. "Just Elaine," I said. "That's enough." She smiled back and handed it to me. Outside, the sun caught the frost and made it sparkle. And in that moment, I realized breaking doesn't always mean something's over. Sometimes it just means the thaw has begun. It's been over a year since scissors touched my hair. I'd been tucking it into low buns, pinning it back, wrapping it in scarves. But I never cut it again in a mirror I didn't choose, and never again while someone else was watching. The community center smelled like brewed tea and wood polish. Someone was playing soft jazz from a speaker near the snack table. Maybe Miles Davis, or someone trying to sound like him. Charlotte's storytelling group was hosting their first public reading. We each had 5 minutes and a microphone. I hadn't decided if I would speak, but I showed up. In the women's restroom, the overhead light was kind, soft enough that I didn't flinch at my own reflection. I set my comb, a small pair of scissors, and a lavender sachet on the edge of the sink. I gathered my hair over one shoulder. The ends were uneven, frayed. I lifted the scissors. "Would you like help with that?" The voice came from behind me, warm. A woman, maybe around 50, stood by the hand dryer. She wore a maroon sweater, black slacks, and her hair was in a long braid streaked with silver. "I'm Grace," she said. "I used to do this for my daughter, before she stopped letting me." I placed the scissors back on the counter. "Would you braid it?" I asked. Her eyes softened. I'd be honored. I turned and sat on the small wooden bench against the wall. She gathered my hair like she already understood it. Her hands were steady. When she reached the nape of my neck, I didn't pull away. We didn't speak much, just enough for the silence to feel like trust. "My daughter hasn't spoken to me in 6 years," she said. "Sometimes I wonder if I imagined her." I nodded. "Sometimes I wonder if I disappeared and no one noticed." When she finished, she tied the braid with a thin lavender ribbon.
I reached back and touched the end, just to feel that it was mine. That night, I called Charlotte. "I think I'm ready to be visible again," I told her. She didn't ask what that meant. She simply said, "Then let's get you a spotlight." So I stood on that stage with nothing but a note card and a fresh braid down my back. The room wasn't packed, but it didn't need to be. I read slowly. "I'm not a victim. I was an editor. Just too late to rewrite the foreword. But the chapters are mine now, and I've stopped asking for someone else's pen." The room went still. A few people exhaled. Grace gave me a small nod from the back row. And then I said, "And this time, when I sleep, I leave the door open, not for forgiveness, but for air." There was something about letting a stranger braid my hair that reminded me how long I'd spent bracing for harm, even inside kindness. Healing doesn't always come from fixing what broke. Sometimes it comes from naming it and choosing to move forward anyway. Family may shape how we begin, but it doesn't get to decide how we end. And when we stop begging to be seen, something shifts. We start seeing ourselves more clearly. If anything I've shared feels familiar to you, if you've held a silence too long, or reclaimed a truth that once felt lost, I'd be honored to hear it. You're welcome to share it in the comments. And if you've ever been mistaken for someone you're not, I hope you'll stay for what comes next. It begins the day my daughter told a restaurant cashier, "Don't talk to her, that old woman is just the maid." But this time, I didn't stay silent.